Today at ETX Create, we'll be making a rustic shelf-sitter version of something that meant a lot to me growing up in the 80s, the iconic NES controller for the original Nintendo. I started by printing out a couple of photos for reference. I printed it oversized at 7 3/8 by 3 1/4, since that's about how big I wanted the final piece to be. I then raided the scrap bin looking for pieces that could work. I found a piece that could work for the base, and some cutoff pieces I could mold into buttons, the D-pad, and the button bases. The main piece was warped, so I needed to run it through the joiner. This will make the wood nice and smooth and also help the piece sit up straight. First, I set the depth of the cut on the gauge to 1/32 of an inch. Then I ran the top and bottom through first, making sure to keep the front and back pressed against the fence. This is key to making the edges perpendicular to the faces. Next, I ran the front and back through once. One pass should be enough to clean the rough wood enough for painting. If you're going for the rustic look, you may want to limit how much refining you do to the wood. Keeping it a bit rough adds character. I transfer the width of the controller base from the photo to the wood. I make sure to inset the marks. Since the current edges are rough and not square, insetting them will allow you to clean them up on the table saw. I usually use oversized wood on projects until I'm cutting to a final size. Here I'm using a table saw sled to square the ends up and to cut the width to the final size. If you don't have a table saw sled yet, I highly advise building one. This is one of the most used tools in our shop. Okay, I think this is about it on the controller base. It's relatively flat, sits up straight, and smooth enough. I'm not even going to sand it. Now to make the D-pad. My measurement is about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, so it will break down into 1/2 inch segments. I draw a line at the end to clean the edge up. Then I measure and make marks every 1/2 inch. Once done, it should look like a large plus sign. The little X's in the corners will be cut out using the table saw sled. My first cut is to square the end up. Then I'll stop the saw and set the blade heights. We'll use 1/2 inch today. I just eyeballed it using the marks on the wood. For rustic pieces, accuracy isn't all that important. I make a test pass to make sure the blade is set to the right height. Since it was close enough, I began cutting away the unwanted material. I'm just eyeballing it here. I'm not worried about making it perfect. Aligning the lines you drew on the wood with the kerf cut in the table saw sled should be good enough. Just make sure you're aligning with the correct side of the kerf cut. After I finished making all the passes, it was time to separate the D-pad with one last cut. There, not too bad. Almost looks like an NES controller already. The next step is to make the A and B buttons. I found some old cutoff pieces from some table legs that had rounded dowel sections at the top. These are almost the perfect size. To prevent tear out when cutting, I wrap the dowel sections with tape. Then I eyeballed where I wanted to make the cuts on the dowels and lock down the fence. I used a square piece of plywood to help guide the dowels across the blade and to keep the piece straight. Looking good so far. 2 more buttons and the button bases to go. I'll create the start and select buttons by using the end grain of the scrap piece. The buttons on the controller have rounded corners, so I'll use the roundover bit on the router to mimic this. Since the buttons are so small, I will only round over a few inches of this piece on all 4 edges. Now I will set up a stop block so I can make 2 buttons of equal size. I'll use a removable piece as well so the small piece won't bind between the stop block and the blade. Remove the loose stop block, make your cut, then repeat. Now the buttons and D-pad are done, it's time to sand. I use a metal file to clean up the rough edges and any splintering. Now to create the raised platforms the buttons will sit on. Once again, I cleaned up the end. Normally I cut off 1/8 of an inch or so. Then I eyeballed the width and made a mark on the sled fence so I can match the second cut. I place the remaining scrap piece on the controller base with buttons in place and get a rough marking to where I want to cut. Then I make the cut. Simple. Now place the buttons, the D-pad, and platforms in position and give it a once-over to make sure the proportions are somewhat accurate. I coated the bottom of the D-pad with wood glue and spread it with my finger. You don't need a lot for a piece this size. I then placed the D-pad on the base and aligned it perpendicular to the bottom using an adjustable square. I used a steel spring clamp to hold it in place to dry. I then repeated the process on the base for the start and select buttons as well as the A and B buttons. Once they've set for a while, I began to glue the A and B buttons on. I just eyeballed them to be close to center. I used the adjustable square to align the remaining buttons. I then placed a scrap piece of wood on top of the buttons, and then used the glue bottle as weight to apply pressure. After giving it time to dry, it was time to apply the stain. I used a dark walnut and a foam brush. I even managed to remember to put gloves on this time. This step really is to taste. Apply heavier coats multiple times for a darker stain. I just went with a single medium coat. Make sure to get all sides. Now for the paint. Start by masking off the intersection by leaving an equal border around all edges. We'll paint the inside black and the masked edges gray. The paint that I'm using is an acrylic craft paint like you'd get at Hobby Lobby. Now paint the base, the D-pad, and the start and select buttons black. Just give it a quick, solid coat. Doesn't really matter since we'll be sanding a lot of it off anyway. Remember, rustic. This paint dries fast, so you don't have to let it sit long. I'll begin painting the button bases a light gray. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I try to keep the runs and the mess ups to a minimum. Now mask off the inner black area and paint the top and the bottom edges the same gray as the button bases. Now peel off the masking tape and mask the remaining two sides. Paint the remaining borders the same as before. Begin painting the A and B buttons a bright red. Don't worry about being perfect. Now to paint the three strops above the Start and Select buttons. I masked each line in stages and used a darker gray this time. Now for the last paint detail, the lettering. I created stencils using a Cricut machine and a fake Nintendo font. If you don't have a Cricut, then you can do them by hand. Just use a fine tip brush. Roughly fill in the stencil using the same red paint used on the A and B buttons. The controller is basically done at this point. How far you take the next step is up to you. Let's give it a bit of sanding to add some weathering and aging. Toning down the paint and removing half of it will help the look of it a lot. This stage is where it really comes together. Now we'll take the same stain as we used earlier to age it even more. Take a paper towel and a light amount of stain and smear it over the painted areas. This will make the paint look older and take the shine off of it. How far you take it is up to you. The last step is to give it a protective coat. I used a water-based finish. It goes on easy and dries fast. I only applied one coat to the front but probably should have done the whole thing. Well, here's the final product. I hope you enjoyed it and thank you for watching.